I found this in your bag. Tell me the truth. Are you receiving treatment?
Tabo was a name spoken with admiration in the golden streets of Santone, Johannesburg, a name that carried weight, respect, and silent envy, because at only 28 years old, he had achieved what many men only dreamed of by 50. He owned a magnificent mansion in one of South Africa's most elite neighborhoods, a house guarded by towering walls and a black and gold gate that gleamed like royalty itself had blessed it, and people passing by often slowed their cars just to stare, wondering what kind of man lived behind such beauty. Yet Tabo was not loud, not flashy, not reckless like other young rich men, for discipline was stitched into his bones from childhood by his late father and constantly reinforced by his mother, Mama Nandi, who always reminded him that a man without self-control was like a city without walls, easily invaded and destroyed, and Tabo lived by those words with almost religious devotion, waking every morning before sunrise to pray, exercise, eat clean, and drive his sleek black Mercedes-Benz to his office, where money flowed to him effortlessly through his work as a financial consultant. Yet, despite his wealth, women, and power, he remained untouched by scandal, untouched by reckless desire, untouched by the kind of temptation that had ruined many men before him. However, fate has a strange sense of humor, because in the very same estate where Tabo lived, just a few houses away, resided Naledi, a woman whose beauty could stop traffic and whose smile could convince a saint to doubt heaven, a woman whose skin glowed like polished cocoa butter and whose elegance made people assume her life was perfect. Yet beneath her flawless appearance lived a secret so heavy it pressed on her chest every night like a stone. For Naledi had been HIV positive since 2019, infected by a man who had sweet-talked her, used her, and vanished like smoke, leaving her with nothing but bitterness, anger, and medication she secretly collected every month from a far-off Soweto clinic where no one recognized her. Pills she swallowed faithfully to keep the virus quiet in her blood like a sleeping lion. Yet while the medicine controlled her body, it could not heal her heart, because resentment slowly twisted her pain into something darker, something dangerous. And as she watched happy couples, successful men, and carefree lives around her, a poisonous thought began to grow in her mind. If she was condemned to suffer, why should others escape untouched? And so when Naledi first noticed Tabo, the disciplined bachelor who ignored flirtation and moved with quiet purpose, something snapped inside her. Not love, not desire, but obsession mixed with vengeance. And the seed of destruction took root, watered daily by envy and rage, until one bright Saturday morning when Tabo prepared to leave for golf, destiny placed Naledi's white BMW directly in front of his gate, blocking his exit like a deliberate challenge. And when Tabo stepped out to investigate, unaware that the car was perfectly fine and that he was stepping into a carefully staged lie, Naledi emerged wearing a dangerously short dress and an innocent apology, playing the role of a helpless woman with terrifying perfection. And though Tabo's spirit warnings, his upbringing forced him to help, forced him to be kind, forced him to ignore the quiet voice urging him to walk away. And with that single act of kindness checking an engine that never needed fixing, offering assistance to a stranger who needed none to bow, unknowingly opened the gate not just to his home, but to a storm that would soon tear through his life. Because some evils do not arrive with horns and fire. They arrive with beauty, gratitude, and a soft smile. And as Naledi hugged him tightly in fake relief and asked for his phone number, the ancestors watched in silence, knowing that this meeting was not accidental, not random, but the first move in a game whose price would be paid in blood, truth, and irreversible loss. From the moment Naledi saved Tabo's number into her phone, she began weaving a web so delicate and patient that even a careful man like him would never notice. The threads tightening around his life, because some traps are not built with force but with repetition, familiarity, and false comfort. And soon her white BMW began developing problems with suspicious regularity: flat tires, weak batteries, faulty wipers, strange engine noises, issue carefully timed. Each phone call delivered with a soft, apologetic voice that sounded harmless enough to disarm suspicion. And every time Tabo came to help, dressed casually, tools in hand, driven by kindness and principle, Naledi played her role perfectly, thanking him with exaggerated gratitude, standing a little too close, wearing clothes a little too revealing, letting her perfume linger in the air long after she had stepped back. Yet Tabo resisted, unaware that resistance itself was fueling her obsession. Because, to Naledi, he was no longer just a man, he was a prize. Proof that she could still conquer purity, discipline, and moral strength. And while she smiled and laughed with him, inside her mind, she counted every interaction like a chess player, planning 10 moves ahead. Slowly, she began inviting him inside her house after every repair, offering cold drinks on hot afternoons, laughing about small things, asking about his childhood, his dreams, his values, and she listened carefully, storing every detail like ammunition for later use. While Tabo's spirit continued sending warning signals he mistook for shyness or overthinking. And though he tried to keep his distance, loneliness crept in quietly. Because success is loud, but solitude is louder. And Naledi filled that silence with warmth, attention, and admiration he rarely received, making him feel seen not as a rich man, but as a good man. Behind the scenes, however, the game became dirtier when Naledi recruited an ally from within Tabo's own fortress Safiso, the gatekeeper whose loyalty dissolved the moment money flashed before his eyes. And with a few crisp banknotes, she purchased information more valuable than gold, learning exactly when Tabo was home, alone, or vulnerable, confirming the ancient truth that betrayal rarely comes from enemies, but from familiar faces. And with this knowledge, Naledi escalated her tactics, arranging accidental encounters, shared coffees, casual outings that slowly blurred into something resembling friendship, then emotional attachment, and Tabo, believing he was choosing carefully, failed to see that every step was already chosen for him. As weeks turned into months, Naledi tightened the emotional rope around his heart, laughing at jokes that weren't funny, praising his discipline, validating his values, presenting herself as the woman who understood him unlike others, while her bitterness simmered beneath the surface like lava beneath cooled rock. And though Tabo still refused physical intimacy, his emotional walls began to crack. because constant presence breeds trust, and trust breeds vulnerability, and vulnerability is the doorway through which destruction walks uninvited. And on the surface, everything appeared innocent to neighbors growing closer, sharing moments, building connection, but unseen forces were already aligning. Greed had corrupted the gatekeeper, obsession had consumed Naledi, and Tabo's kindness had been weaponized against him, because every favor he offered, every repair he made, every drink he politely refused brought Naledi closer to desperation, closer to rage, closer to a point where seduction would no longer be enough. And as she watched him walk away after another restrained goodbye, her smile fading the moment he turned his back, a dark resolve settled in her heart, because she knew one thing with terrifying certainty: Tabo would be hers, not through love, not through consent, but through a plan so calculated that even heaven would look away in horror when it finally unfolded. By the time Naledi realized that seduction alone would never conquer Tabo, desperation had already eaten away at her patience like rust on iron, because every visit ended the same way: soft music, intentional closeness, teasing laughter, and then rejection wrapped in politeness. Tabo always pulling back, always insisting on boundaries, always claiming that something in his spirit told him to wait. And to Naledi, this was not virtue but humiliation, a rejection that reopened wounds she had buried under designer clothes and fake confidence, and each refusal whispered the same cruel message into her mind: you are damaged, you are unwanted, you are less. And slowly that whisper turned into rage so loud it drowned out the last traces of her conscience. She smiled through clenched teeth, played the patient woman, pretended to respect his values, but inside her heart she began rewriting the rules. Because if he would not give himself willingly, she would take from him without permission. And the thought, once formed, did not frighten, hurt, comforted her, boo, 'cause pain had already reshaped her sense of right and wrong. The following days she became more calculated, more attentive, more strategic, pretending affection while studying his routines, his weaknesses, his trust, noting how easily he relaxed around her now, how he accepted drinks without suspicion, how his guard dropped in the comfort of familiarity. And when the idea finally crystallized, it felt to her like justice disguised as opportunity. She drove far from Santone to a quiet township pharmacy where nobody knew her face, bought the strongest sleeping pills she could find, pills meant for severe cases, pills powerful enough to silence consciousness. And as she held them in her palm, her heart pounded, not with fear but anticipation, because the line between victim and villain had already been crossed in her mind. The invitation came casually, dressed as kindness diner laughter. His favorite pap and Borwersand, though Tabo hesitated, sensing danger without understanding it. Empathy betrayed him once again, because he could not bear the sadness in her voice, could not imagine harm from someone who had shown him nothing but affection. And so he agreed, unaware that every ingredient in that meal, every smile across the table, every clink of cutlery was part of a final performance. The house was warm, the food delicious, the atmosphere disarmingly normal. And when Naledi offered whiskey afterward, Tabo agreed to a small glass, trusting her, trusting the space, trusting the illusion she had perfected while unseen. 3 crushed pills dissolved silently into his drink, disappearing like truth in the hands of a liar. Minutes passed, laughter faded, and suddenly the world began to tilt for Tabo, his head growing heavy, his limbs unresponsive, confusion clouding his thoughts as Naledi guided him gently to the couch, whispering concern while watching consciousness slip from his eyes. And as thunder gathered outside and rain began to hammer the roof like a warning from the ancestors, Naledi stood over his sleeping body, hearing a small voice inside begging her to stop, reminding her that he was innocent, that this was unforgivable. Yet she crushed that voice beneath years of bitterness, loneliness, and rage, dragging him into her bedroom where consent no longer existed and morality no longer mattered. And on that storm-soaked night, while lightning split the sky and rain washed the streets clean, Naledi committed an act so cruel it would stain every future moment of her life, transferring her virus into Tabo's body without his knowledge, without his choice, without mercy. And when it was done, she cleaned every trace meticulously, restoring the scene to innocence, dressing him, positioning herself beside him on the couch as if nothing had happened, while the real damage flowed unseen through his blood, silent, patient, irreversible. And when morning arrived with deceptive calm, Tabo awoke confused, aching, and unaware that his life had already been rewritten, because the most dangerous betrayals are not those we see coming, but those that happen while we sleep, trusting the wrong heart in the wrong place. Morning arrived, dressed in sunlight and birdsong, cruelly peaceful after the storm that had rewritten Tabo's destiny. And as he woke on Naledi's couch with a pounding headache and a mind wrapped in fog, she performed concern with award-winning precision, explaining that he had suddenly fallen ill after dinner, that she had watched over him all night like a devoted guardian, and because memory failed him and trust filled the gaps, Tabo accepted the story, leaving her house with unease he could not explain, dismissing the strange marks on his body as imagination, because he could not comprehend betrayal of such magnitude. And weeks passed with Naledi glowing in quiet satisfaction, while Tabo's body carried a secret it had not chosen, a secret that would soon begin to speak through fatigue, rashes, coughing nights, and unexplained weakness. Yet Naledi knew that time alone was not enough, because truth has a way of surfacing unless buried beneath a louder lie. And so she began preparing her escape route, her scapegoat, her insurance against suspicion. She remembered Tabo's severe garlic allergy, a detail she had carefully stored like a weapon. And 2 months later, she invited him for lunch, serving a lovingly prepared meal laced deliberately with crushed garlic, watching calmly as his throat tightened, his skin erupted, and panic replaced pleasure, rushing him to the hospital with tears that fooled everyone except the ancestors. And as doctors fought to stabilize him, Naledi studied every movement in the emergency room, noting the nurse who administered the injection, memorizing faces, timing, procedures, because lies told later must be specific to be believed. Tabo survived, but the seed of doubt had been planted. And a year later, when illness could no longer be ignored, and blood tests confirmed the unthinkable that he was, HIV-positive Tabo's world collapsed inward, his identity shattering as he replayed every choice, every boundary, every disciplined decision that should have protected him. And for days he locked himself away in grief so raw it stripped meaning from wealth, success, and future dreams, until memory connected broken dots, the hospital, the injection, Naladi's watchful eyes, and when he voiced this suspicion aloud, Naledi seized the moment like a predator sensing wounded prey, suggesting with trembling outrage that the nurse might have used a contaminated needle, swearing she had seen something suspicious, feeding his confusion until anger replaced sorrow. And together they returned to the hospital where an innocent nurse, Tandis, stood stunned beneath accusations she could not defend against fear-driven management desperate to avoid scandal. And despite her tears and protests, she became the sacrifice, fired, stripped of her license, her career destroyed in a single afternoon, while Naledi smiled privately, knowing the truth had been buried beneath bureaucracy and blame. Tabo believed justice had been served, unaware that the woman comforting him at night was the architect of his suffering. And as depression hollowed him out, Naledi tightened her grip, presenting herself as unwavering support, declaring love stronger than illness, refusing to leave him when he tried to protect her by ending the relationship, sealing her role as angel in his eyes while wearing the face of a demon beneath. And when they married months later, beneath smiling guests and uneasy ancestral silence, Mama Nendi's troubled spirit sensed danger she could not name, yet love, or what Tabo believed to be love, drowned out warning bells, and years passed with medication, routine, and performance, Naledi playing the loyal wife flawlessly until one ordinary afternoon cracked the illusion, when Tabo searched her handbags for car keys and instead found a hospital card bearing her name, stamped with HIV treatment dates from years before they met. And in that instant, truth erupted like a volcano, flooding his mind with clarity so sharp it stole his breath, the drugged drink, the missing consent, the nurse's ruined life, the calculated lies, and as the card slipped from his shaking fingers to the floor, Tabo realized that the greatest betrayal had not come from strangers or systems, but from the woman he trusted with his life, because evil does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, "I love you," while destroying everything you are. Tabo stood frozen in the middle of the bedroom, the small hospital card feeling heavier in his hand than any burden he had ever carried, because in that thin piece of plastic lived answers to questions that had nearly driven him mad. And as his mind replayed the past like a cursed film, every scene suddenly made brutal sense: the strange taste of the whiskey, the unnatural sleep, the unexplained pain in his body, Naladi's eagerness to blame the nurse, her theatrical loyalty afterward, and with each realization his heart cracked further, grief mixing with rage, until his chest burned with betrayal so deep it felt physical. And when Naledi returned home, humming softly, unaware that the stage lights had shifted, she found Tabo seated in silence, the card resting on the table between them like a loaded weapon. And in that moment her confidence faltered for the first time, because lies survive in darkness but tremble. At first she denied, laughed nervously, called it a misunderstanding, claimed the card belonged to a cousin. But when Tabo calmly recited dates, locations, and timelines with terrifying precision, her mask shattered, and something ugly surfaced in her eyes, something cold and unapologetic, and she stopped pretending, admitting not with tears but with bitterness that life had been unfair, that she had suffered alone, that she refused to be the only one condemned, justifying rape, infection, and destruction as fate balancing itself. And those words wounded Tabo more than the virus ever could, because they revealed a soul emptied of empathy. He demanded justice, threatened police and courts, but Naledi laughed softly, reminding him of the lack of evidence. The years passed, the consent he could not disprove, the system that would question him harder than her. And in that cruel laughter he understood that she had not only stolen his health but engineered his helplessness. And as their marriage collapsed in screams, tears, and shattered furniture, the truth finally reached Mama Nandi, whose grief turned into a firestorm of prayer and ancestral appeal. Because some crimes cry louder to the spirit world than to the law. And as Naledi fled the house that night, dragging her bags behind her like the wreckage of her choices, Tabo sat alone, broken but awakened, realizing that survival now meant more than medicine. It meant truth, accountability, and reclaiming the dignity stolen from him while he slept. Days later, driven by conscience and clarity, Tabo returned to the hospital, seeking out Tanasi, the nurse whose life had been destroyed in his name. And when he apologized through tears, confessing everything, her pain met his remorse in a quiet room, heavy with injustice. Yet forgiveness began to bloom, fragile but real, and together they reopened the case, this time with evidence, time, and a confession Naledi never thought would surface. Because guilt, like disease, eventually shows symptoms. And as investigations reopened and whispers spread, Tabo discovered that healing does not come from revenge, but from standing in truth, no matter how painful. And while Naledi's world began to crumble under exposure, Tabo's slowly rebuilt itself, not as the man he once was, but as one forged by betrayal, awakened by suffering, and strengthened by the decision to choose light after surviving deliberate darkness. When the truth finally escaped the walls Naledi had built around it, it moved fast and without mercy, because lies can survive in private. And as investigators reopened the case with new testimony, timelines, pharmacy records, and Naledi's own crumbling inconsistencies, the woman who once walked Santone with her head held high found herself trapped in a spotlight she could not manipulate. Questioned relentlessly about her diagnosis dates, her medication pickups, the sleeping pills purchased under a false pretext, and the night Tabo lost consciousness in her house. And while she tried to maintain composure, the cracks showed, her stories shifting like sand, her anger betraying fear, because for the first time she was no longer in control of the narrative. Tabo, meanwhile, walked through this storm carrying equal parts pain and resolve, forced to relive the worst night of his life in interviews and statements, yet strengthened by the knowledge that silence would only protect evil. And when Tandasi's nursing license was provisionally reinstated pending final review, the weight of injustice began lifting from at least one innocent soul, reminding Tabo that speaking the truth, even late, still matters. Naledi's social circle evaporated almost overnight, friends distancing themselves as whispers hardened into facts. Invitations stopped coming, smiles turned to judgment, and the same beauty that once opened doors now could not shield her from accountability. Because society forgives many sins but recoils from calculated cruelty, especially when masked as love and as charges mounted sexual assault, intentional transmission of a life-altering disease. Perjury. Naledi's rage turned outward, blaming Tabo, the system, fate, anyone but herself, yet alone at night, stripped of applause and illusion. She was forced to confront the reality she had spent years avoiding, that her pain never justified becoming a weapon against another human being. Tabo's healing, however, did not arrive as triumph, but as quiet reconstruction. Therapy sessions, where anger was unpacked. Long talks with Mama Nandi, where tears replaced words. Mornings where medication reminded him of loss, but also of survival. And gradually he learned that masculinity does not mean invulnerability, that being violated does not make one weak, and that dignity can be reclaimed through honesty, boundaries, and self-respect. And as court dates approached, he chose not to define himself by what was done to him, but by what he would do next, supporting awareness programs, speaking anonymously at first, then openly, breaking the silence around male victims and HIV stigma, turning his suffering into a voice for others who believed no one would listen. Naledi, watching this transformation from the sidelines, felt a different kind of fear, not of prison, but of irrelevance, of being remembered not as a victim of circumstance, but as the architect of her own downfall. And in that realization lay the harshest punishment of all, because no sentence could erase the truth now etched into public memory. As the case moved forward and justice slowly aligned itself with truth, the ancestors seemed finally appeased, storms giving way to calm. And though Tabo knew his life would never return to what it once was, he also knew it could still be meaningful, still be full, still be guided, because survival is not the absence of scars, but the courage to live honestly with them. And in choosing truth over bitterness, Tabo reclaimed the one thing Naledi could never steal his soul. Years later, long after courtrooms emptied and headlines faded, Tabo learned that justice does not always arrive with noise, but with alignment, a quiet settling of truth into its rightful place. Because Naledi's fall was not dramatic in the way movies promise, but complete in the way reality demands, convictions etched into record, friendships dissolved into silence, beauty stripped of power, and a life once curated for admiration reduced to accountability, while Tabo's life, though permanently changed, began to expand in unexpected directions, rebuilt not on innocence, but on wisdom, not on success alone, but on service. And in that rebuilding he discovered that pain, when carried honestly, can become purpose. He spoke openly now, not to shock, but to educate, reminding communities that consent is sacred regardless of gender, that HIV is a medical condition, not a moral verdict, that stigma feeds lies while truth saves lives. And as his voice grew steadier, so did his peace, because naming the wound no longer reopened it, it sealed it. And Mama Nandi, who had prayed without ceasing, watched her son with the quiet pride of a mother who knows that survival is a kind of victory the world rarely applauds. Tendency, the nurse once destroyed by a lie, returned to her calling with dignity restored, caring for patients with a tenderness sharpened by injustice, proof that truth can resurrect what falsehood buries. And even Naledi, confined to the narrow corridors of consequence, was forced to confront a lesson the ancestors teach without compromise, that pain explains behavior but never excuses harm, that victimhood cannot be weaponized, and that love, used as a disguise for cruelty, will always be exposed by time. Tabo did not celebrate her downfall, because healing had taught him that joy rooted in another's suffering poisons the soul. But he did insist on remembrance, on telling the story not as entertainment but as warning, because kindness without discernment invites danger. Boundaries are not cruelty but protection, and silence in the face of wrongdoing makes accomplices of the innocent. In community halls and quiet conversations, elders nodded as the moral settled where it belonged, that character is revealed not when life is fair, but when it is not. That discipline without wisdom is incomplete. That desire denied can turn to obsession if not checked by conscience. And that the ancestors watch not only what we do, but why we do it. On a warm afternoon in Santon, Tabo stood once more before the black and gold gate of his home. The same gate where this story had begun, and though the metal still shone, he understood now that walls and wealth do not keep danger out, discernment does so. He closed his eyes, breathed deeply, and chose forward motion over fear, connection over isolation, truth over comfort, because life after betrayal is not about forgetting, but about integrating the lesson without letting it define you. And as the sun dipped low and the city hummed with ordinary life, the ancestors, satisfied at last, whispered a final truth into the wind. Evil may be patient, beauty may deceive, and kindness may be tested, but truth, when spoken and lived, outlives them all, and that is the ending they never forget.